Something's going wrong in the neighborhood. Why do we see further than we should? All around us people run away, like some wind to sea without a care. There simply is no curve inside, and you know we don't spend all day and night. It seems they want our minds flooded with lies. If you want to bust the globe, I know these guys. Who you gonna call? Who you gonna call? Who you gonna call? Who you gonna call? Globebusters.
Who you gonna call when the horizon flattens out? Go ahead, call them up, see what that's about. We can go around in circles trying to find us out, but if you're looking for the truth, you got to find it out. NASA can't go to space, so we hit the roof. Get it? Hit the roof. And it all came to light with 200 proofs. Now I'm just really sick of people lying to me. So when I tell the truth, don't come crying to me. Pick up the phone, get on the line with me. Line with me. Who you gonna call? Who you gonna call? Who you gonna call?
All right. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Excellent. You guys enjoying the conference so far? Outstanding. That's good. We had a great turnout for Canada. I'm very impressed. This is awesome. So we're very glad to be here, and here at the second time we've ever been at a conference. This is really cool for us, and just glad everybody could make it. So anyway, let me introduce my co-host here. I'm sure most of you know him. He is Jeran from Jeranism. And say hello, Jeran.
Well, thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you. Appreciate very warm welcome from everybody that I've met so far, and big thank you to Robbie for inviting me. Almost didn't make it, believe it or not. I think I won the world record for quickest to get a passport in 3 hours. So I had a passport card, but I didn't have a passport book and didn't know I couldn't fly here. So found that out the day before I was supposed to fly and took care of it. We're here. We're happy. And it's been great. Looks like the country's beautiful. It's my first time in Canada. I love the smoke that you guys have all around the horizon. It's an interesting thing I didn't expect. And it's just awesome to be here and awesome to have the two other members of the Globebusters with us as well. So awesome.
Yes, and that is the surprise that we have. We also have with us the rest of the Globebusters crew, live from Skype. John, of course, John the Morgal is in the United States, and Eru is in Argentina. So we'll go ahead and introduce John first. John the Morgal. How you doing, buddy?
What's up, guys? What's up, Canada? How y'all doing? Yeah.
All right. Got a big hand for that. And we also have, he's kind of upside down, but we have Eru Landucci from Argentina with us. How you doing, Eru?
Hello, Canada. How you doing? How you doing, Bob, Jeran, John? It's a pleasure to be. We live in the land of the upside down. So, for me, I'm normal orientation.
Right.
I don't know what are you talking about.
Awesome. Okay, guys. Well, we're glad you could join us up here. It's kind of a bummer you couldn't be here in person, but this is the next best thing, and everybody's going to be enjoying it. So that's great. All right, guys. So we have several things that we're going to be talking about today. I talked with Robbie. I actually had an entirely different type of show planned, but I talked to Robbie a few days ago. And it turns out that nobody was really going to be doing kind of a Flat Earth 101 type of conference. And the reason that we decided to do our material kind of on the 101 stuff is there's a lot of new people here. There's a lot of press here. And we kind of want to give them kind of a taste of what got us all into this, or at least, Jeran and I and Iro and John, and what started us off. So we're going to go ahead and start our presentation. And Iro, before we start, was there anybody else that you wanted to have say hello, or do you want to have him say hello a little bit later? Or do you even know what I'm talking about? All right.
The chicas.
Yeah.
Oh, we lost your
Whoops,
sound.
we lost your audio, Iro.
Oh,
Nope.
probably
no
on
audio.
mute.
Oh, because I have mute the mic,
Oh, okay.
you know. But no, I don't know what you're talking about. So continue with the show, please. I'm a little nervous, so make me easy, please.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, I guess the first thing I want to talk about is why do we call ourselves the Globebusters? And we do that because of the belief that we have come to over the last several years that we are not on a spinning ball. And so we decided, we kind of thought of lots of different names, and Globebusters was the one that we settled on, probably a little better than Ballbusters, which was my choice. But so we settled on Globebusters, and Jeran and I have been doing this 3 years as of July. So just last month we had our 3 years anniversary. So happy anniversary, sweetheart.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful.
Didn't buy me a gift again. 3 years in a row.
I know. I'm really bad about that. So anyway, when we talk about flat Earth, I kind of like to talk about all the different things that led me here. And even though, in my opinion, there are some things that constitute a smoking gun, a lot of people wouldn't see it that way. So I kind of decided to take the approach of what's called a preponderance of evidence. And this is kind of a term that they use in law firms and in the legal trade and all that. And basically what a preponderance of evidence is it's an amount of evidence that gives weight to your argument. So instead of, betting the farm on one single thing, there's lots of things that really add up that kind of make you stand back and be in doubt of the ball. So that's what the preponderance of evidence is, and that's what we're going to kind of introduce some of those things today. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and I'm going to minimize you and Iro John for just a minute so I can get to my presentation, actually I won't do that yet, I'm sorry. And you forgive me guys, this is the first time we've done this, so we're a little new at this still. So I guess some of the things I want to cover are some of the heliocentric basics that we are told about the heliocentric model of the universe, and some things that we are not. Yeah. Whoops. Iro?
Now he doesn't realize he's not on
now
mute.
he doesn't know. Hey, Iro, you're not muted. Okay. So the first thing we have is they tell us that the sun is 93 million miles away, technically 92,900,000, something like that, which of course is an unfathomable distance.
Sí, va a pasar ahora.
Iru.
No. Agarrá la plata, no.
Iru.
Oh, yeah. Oh, maybe we can mute them. Sorry about that, guys. All right. So we have the sun at 93 million miles away. It has a diameter of 865,000 miles, okay, which is, again, unfathomable. They tell us that the moon is 239,000 miles away, and it has a diameter of 2,160 miles, okay? Now, in the sky, they don't really look that big to us. In fact, when you look up at the sun or the moon, they both have about a 1/2 degree angular size, which is pretty little, about the size of a dime if you hold it up there. And we're going to point out some things about that really don't add up, especially with the brightnesses, the sizes, the distances. There's a lot of incongruencies that we see, and they just don't add up, and I don't think they're going to add up for you guys either. So another thing that they don't teach us about our Earth is that it obviously has a curvature. If it's a sphere, there has to be a curvature figure to it. And that curvature figure is about 8 inches per mile squared, okay? And a lot of people will kind of argue about that, plus or minus. Let me close that. But basically, this is the curvature chart that we've got here. Whoops. You can bring up the screen there. real quick for us? There we go. And what we're seeing here is we're just basically seeing 3 different calculations that show the accuracy of the 8 inches per mile squared figure. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's ridiculous. It doesn't work, especially when you get all the way around to the radius of the Earth, the 3959 miles, and that's generally true. However, there are other ways to determine it. One is called the Sagitta. There's another calculation that can be done in AutoCAD. But as you can see, they go all the way across. They're pretty close all the way up until you get to about 1,000 miles. And after 1,000 miles, they start deviating by a mile or 2. But for the most part, for our purposes, 8 inches per mile squared works very, very well. So a lot of people don't really realize that, what that adds up to. And when you're looking for the curvature, when you're hunting for it, or when you're measuring for the curvature, obviously you have to have these figures in mind. And, so we'll take a few instances here. If we have basically 10 miles away, we have a curvature of 66.69 feet, or 66.68, so it's about 67 feet, something like that. You go up to 50 miles, and you're looking all of a sudden at 1,667 feet, or 1,666 feet, roughly, in that area, which is a lot of curvature, especially over 50 miles. And then it really starts adding up, because this is an exponential type of thing. So by the time you get up to 100 miles, you are at 6,666.6 feet, which, of course, is well over a mile, and it's an enormous figure. And that's something that a lot of people don't really think about, because many times we can actually look out and see 100 miles or more, especially if we're in an airplane or we're at a good vantage point or we just have a good clear day. We can see 100 miles and even further sometimes. So when you start thinking about how much curvature should be there, well over a mile, it doesn't make any sense. And a lot of people will try and tell you that you can't really see that from the ground, and that may or may not be true, because remember, wherever you are, you're on the top of the ball, and the ball is falling away from you in all different directions at that very same curvature rate. So even if not on the ground, certainly you should be able to see it when you get up into an airliner at 35,000, 40,000 feet. But when you do, there's no curve there. When you go up in a balloon to 120,000, 130,000 feet, still there's absolutely no curvature there, nothing like that. And, we ask ourselves, where's the curvature? It's just not there. So
one of the sites that you can go to is called beyondhorizons.eu, and it's just an interesting website that people submit.
You read my mind.
Yeah.
I just put that up there.
Oh, good. Yeah, you submit your images or photos that you've taken, and there's ranges from anywhere from 400 miles on down. Now, some of those are from extremely high locations. So if you're, at a 2-mile high mountain and you're looking at a 2-mile high mountain, that's not quite flat Earth proof. That's just being able to see further than most people think you can. But when you're looking at, like, I know Bob, the picture of Canigau up now, and Canigau is a mountain near France. It is 175 miles this image is taken from, and the mountain itself is only 9,000 feet, and the location that it's being taken from is 1,000 feet. And when you do the calculations, that comes out to should be about 13,000 feet hidden behind the curvature. So the fact that we see that mountain, you shouldn't even see the tip of it. If you saw the tip of it, you would still be 4,000 feet of unknown. Where did that come from? What happened to the curve? You have to believe in mountains that levitate or something raising those mountains up. And then when you realize that how much of that mountain you actually see there, is it up? Yeah. When you realize that that's not just the tip, you're seeing a majority of that mountain, then you start to realize why. And there's so many places around the world like that. I just don't think enough people are looking. And as people look and see and start to recognize these things, that more will come out. There's so many places where you're looking across bodies of water of 100 or more miles. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out soon.
Yeah, and these images are not a mirage.
Right. No.
These are absolutely real. There are dozens of instances. If any of you have watched like Eric Dubé's 200 Proofs, there's just instance after instance of things that we should not ever be able to see And it doesn't really matter what the humidity is, what the temperature is. I mean, yes, the humidity, temperature, air density will factor in to refraction, but there's never that much refraction, especially the kind of refraction that would perfectly match the curvature of the Earth with your vision. That just doesn't happen. And of course, a lot of the globe believers would like us to believe that that's what's happening, and it's simply impossible. And beyond that, there is no experiment that really shows anything that can cause an image to come up from behind an obstruction, and that you would be able to see it, especially with such an incredible clarity. Now, there are mirages. There are superior mirages. There are things like that, but it's pretty obvious when it's actually a mirage. I mean, you can tell there's distortion in it. Most of the time, the image will be inverted. As you can see, these images are not inverted. They're crystal clear. Like the image of the Chicago skyline is something that we've all seen, and that is absolutely a crystal clear image. That is not a mirage, contrary to what the weatherman said. So there's just so many instances of it. It's kind of mind-boggling that people can write it off to refraction. It just simply doesn't work that way. So
really, you can start out at any lake or ocean that you might live near. If you can get a spot that's 6 or 7 miles across, and we've seen tons of people do it, Taboo Conspiracy and Paul on the Plain, people like that are just doing 7-mile stretches, basically take a laser and shine it off of something black like this and have somebody across the water zoom in with a camera. And if the camera's 2-3 feet off the water and your laser's the same height off the water, that's impossible to be seen on a globe, and yet everybody is seeing it. So that's got to tell you something.
In fact, here in Argentina, we have a real good situation, because from Uruguay to Argentina, you can see coast to coast, and there are like 55 kilometers, which represent like 200 meters of curvature, and we see all the skyline from Buenos Aires. So the problem here in Argentina is that we are not a development country, so the most tall building is only about 170 meters. So we can see like 40 buildings from Uruguay to Buenos Aires, and none of those buildings should be seen if the Earth has the measurement and is a ball.
Yes, absolutely true.
I think it's real important to sort of explain to someone that's looking at this for the first time, well, what do we mean by this curvature? So if the Earth was a ball, over a certain distance, you would expect to see a certain amount of vertical descent due to this alleged curvature of the Earth. And what I find really striking is that nowhere in my life do I ever remember learning what this expected vertical descent should be over, say, a mile. And what's really just crazy about this is that it's flat earthers who are getting this sort of thing out and not globe earthers, because nowhere in globe earth education or science do you find curvature formulas or calculations that anyone can use to demonstrate this curvature for themselves. And in fact, when you test for it, it doesn't exist. And if you look at things like the ships over the horizon, as Christopher Columbus allegedly purported, that there's this assumption that the Earth is a ball and light only ever always travels in perfectly straight lines. And in fact, we know now that light indeed refracts and bends through the atmosphere, does not travel in straight lines. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing curved light essentially over a flat Earth, and not a ball Earth with light only ever traveling in straight lines. And so it really is, it turns out, the more you look into this, it's not just one or two pieces of evidence fit nicely with flat Earth, but any possible thing you can imagine and throw at this, it works nicely and better than the globe. So just wanted to get that in there.
Yeah, and you might hear people say, for instance, with the buildings being seen across Lake Michigan, that, well, there's some water that appears to be covering the bottom of the buildings. And that's something as flat earthers that at first you look at and say, well, yeah, why is there water covering the buildings at all? The better question is to ask, why are the buildings there at all? Because really the globe calls for them to be completely covered. And, we're discovering, daily, basically, what is going on when we see water like Iru showing here at Skunk Bay you can see what happens throughout the day there. That's on the screen? Yeah. You can see where the water is rising and lowering just based on the temperature throughout that day. And so what we noticed from that is that the landmass behind there actually gets submerged by the water. But we know that's not what happens. So these are the kind of things that if science was what we were taught and if science was what we were told it is, then these kind of things would be investigated and, really dug through to find out what is actually going on, but it's not. It's simply just chalked up to, any kind of blockage of buildings or is curvature of the earth, and they don't want to look at it. And that's why we're here and why we have to do this daily, because science isn't doing it. They're just letting us believe what we were all taught, and they want to end the story there.
Yep, absolutely. So, needless to say, observational evidence is everywhere for this. I mean, we simply see further than we should ever be able to. And that right there is one of the biggest clues. And it cannot all be written off to refraction or mirages or anything like that. There's a lot about the atmosphere and atmospheric effects, perspective, the angular resolution of the human eye, which basically a lot of our world is built on. That's something that we could get in at another time, but we've covered it. It's kind of an advanced subject, but there's many, many factors to take into consideration when you're actually observing something. So,
Eru looks like he's trying to. You want to show something, Eru?
Oh, he's showing Rob Skiba's experiment.
Yeah, I try, you know how I am. So I try to, just put some images for the new people and understand what you're talking about. So.
Okay. So Eru will show some of these images, and of course Rob Skiba, who is a speaker at this conference, did a lot of these experiments. And obviously not all of our evidence is simply, just observational. We have much more than that. We have checked the Earth's curvature by a variety of methodologies. I myself have been a pilot for about 40 years now. And, it's really interesting because when they first put you through pilot training, they tell you to pick a point on the horizon and fly towards it, and the plane will basically fly straight and level. You also have instruments on board, gyroscopic instruments, which obviously the claim to fame of a gyroscope is rigidity in space. They do not move around. There's a lot of arguments, counter-arguments about how they work, about pendulous vanes and stuff like that. But the bottom line is that gyroscopes remain rigid in space. And, if you're flying, you should be compensating for the curvature of the Earth. You should have to actually point your nose down because you're flying around a ball, theoretically. Well, the gyroscopic instruments never picked this up. Now, neither did the old-style gyroscopic instruments, like they had when I first started flying. And, of course, they still have those. They still have the mechanical. But these days they even have the ring laser gyroscopes, which work off a Sagnac effect and light phase differential, stuff like that. They also do not pick up any change in pitch or curvature. We also have accelerometers, which are absolutely sensitive enough to be able to measure these very minute pitch changes. In all the experiments that have been done, no pitch change has ever come up. And, the claim that gravity magically compensates for all this is ridiculous. It's patently ridiculous because it simply does not. In fact, the gyroscopes are inertial-based instruments. The MEMS accelerometers are inertial-based instruments. They do not work off of gravity. They supposedly use these things on the space station because of the fact that they are able to maintain their rigidity in space. So lots of experiments have been done with those. We simply cannot detect any curvature or motion. Some of the other experiments that we've done, we have, Jeran and I both belong to an organization called FE Corps, which stands for Field Engineers Corps. And the purpose, the reason that we formed FE Corps, and we did this right about the time of the Raleigh conference, is because we wanted to get a group of engineers together, and we actually formed a nonprofit so that we could get research grants and do some of these very high-tech and expensive tests to be able to prove beyond any reasonable doubt whatsoever that there is no curvature and there is no motion. Well, so far we have conducted a few of those tests. The last one that we just did was a 25-mile or 40-kilometer laser test over Lake IJssel in the Netherlands, and Lake Balaton before that in Hungary?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in Hungary. And again, we had several witnesses there. We had it certified. Absolutely no curvature. We were able to detect those lasers. The refraction that should have been there was calculated out, and nevertheless, we were able to see those beams regardless of what the refraction told us that it should have been. So the conclusion, flat. The next thing that we did after that is we did a microwave test with some small 5 gigahertz microwave dishes. Again, this was done in the Netherlands, and this was done over 25 miles per hour as well. And again, we were able to get a signal through with no problem whatsoever, whereas the curvature of the Earth absolutely calculated to be blocking that signal. So again, every test that we try turns up a net result of absolute zero curvature. We have an upcoming test that will be going from the Netherlands to the White Cliffs of Dover in Great Britain, and this is going to be right at 100 miles, so that's 160 kilometers, I believe. And we anticipate very clearly that not only are we going to be able to see our laser, but we will also be able to pick up our microwave signal, and we will be broadcasting them from very low levels to the point where there should be literally hundreds of feet, if not, over 1,000 feet of curvature that should be blocking those signals. And in this case, in this particular case, between the microwave and the laser, people cannot come back and claim any type of refraction, because that would mean that the refraction for light would be acting precisely the same way as the refraction for the microwave 5 gigahertz signal. Not going to happen. That's not going to work that way. So these are just some of the things that FE Corps is doing, and we have gotten some great sponsors that are behind us, and I think that we're going to be really turning out some great results. And of course, what we're going after with these results is we document it very meticulously, and then we are issuing challenges to universities, scientific organizations, to replicate or debunk or disprove our findings, which I don't think they're going to be able to do. So those are just some of the things that FE Corps is doing. So. All right.
Can I do a screen share real quick?
Oh, certainly, John. Let me bring you back up. Go for it.
All right. So forgive me here we go. So this picture here is the one from Beyond Horizons. That one of these mountains in the distance is 273 miles away. And quite a little while ago, I put together this diagram, which is not to scale, but it does, it sort of represents what's going on here. So the observer in that picture is 1.75 miles in altitude on the top of another mountain. But the peak in the distance, again, is 273 miles away. And we can see with the curvature formula, what we should expect is that the very top of this distant peak should be over a half a mile below the apparent horizon for this observer here, and yet they can see basically the whole mountain from the base to the peak, more or less, which physically shouldn't happen on a ball. And that's assuming that everything remains the same height in the distance when we all see in perspective. And so this observer would actually see this mountain diminish in apparent angular size as well. But just not even getting into that part of the argument, the way that this is rebutted is they'll just say, well, it's refraction causing this mountain to apparently raise up basically 3 miles into the air, according to this observer. And that's the excuse for every example, even, whether it's 273 miles or 50 miles or 75 miles. They always argue refraction, and that just can't be the case. In fact, they call this thing standard refraction, as if refraction has some absolute value that never varies from, when in fact the amount of refraction, as you've seen in the video that Jeran showed you earlier, it's a variable. It's constantly going to change. And so this image here, and I'll go back to the image, really does illustrate nicely that the Earth doesn't have the curvature necessary to result in a sphere, and so therefore it couldn't be a ball. Not a ball of any size, especially when you get into these distances of, over 200 miles. And so just wanted to get that in there because, this visual representation, again, while it's not to scale, it does give you an idea of what we would expect to see on a ball Earth.
Okay, beautiful. All right, so let's move on to a couple other things. Some of the incongruencies that we have, additional incongruencies, I should say, with the heliocentric model would be, first up would be the moon, okay? We're told in the heliocentric model that the moon is basically reflecting the light from the sun, and it goes through different phases, depending on what angle it is to the sun. That's how we get our different phases throughout the month. But the one thing that I want to focus on primarily is what happens on a full moon. Now, we've all seen a full moon. We've seen the harvest moon. We've seen it gigantic. We've seen it all different sides. We've seen many photographs of it. And when the moon is full, it is absolutely brilliantly bright, and it is lit evenly, pretty much evenly from the center to the edges. And in fact, really, the edges seem to be a little bit brighter for the most part, at least in most of the moon photography that I've done. But what you really need to do is you need to think about that for a minute. It's like if you were to take a flashlight and you were to point it at a basketball or any type of a ball, what would you see? Well, what you would see is you would see at the front of the ball, the sphere, something like we're showing right here, you would see a hot spot, okay? The very brightest part would be right in the center. And beyond that, you would see a diminishing light going back towards the equatorial region, okay? We never see that with the moon, and that is a huge incongruency. The lighting of the moon simply cannot be caused by reflecting sunlight. It just makes absolutely no sense. There is no law of physics that explains that, and that is a huge incongruency. So, again, and this is just one example that.
I would still argue, not to be like a devil's advocate, but I would argue that moonlight being reflected sunlight may actually be the case. I mean, it's not incompatible with the notion of a flat Earth, but I mean, it does bring up a good point. Although, in reflected light, there could be some of that energy absorbed by the moon and other, frequencies of that energy reflected. But just wanted to mention that because that is a point of contention for a lot of people, or at least when people say that, that the moonlight couldn't possibly, and this goes all the way back to Zetetic from the 1860s. Even Robotham argued that moonlight couldn't possibly be reflected sunlight because, it's a cooling light. It has putrefying effects as opposed to, moonlight has putrefying effects where sunlight has preservative effects. So there are different properties between sunlight and moonlight, but I think it is a bit of a leap to say that therefore, moonlight couldn't possibly be reflected sunlight because to me at least, there is a lot of evidence that the moon's phases are somehow correlated to its relationship position to the sun. But
yeah,
my 2 cents.
Yeah, and you'll find that, obviously, straight up, I disagree with that, but that's okay and you'll find that there's a lot of thought and conjecture about, the nature of things and amongst flat earthers. And that's, mostly because we don't have a $52 million a day budget to go and research on this. So what we're presenting to you today, at least in our opinions, is common sense. And in my mind, common sense tells me that if I shine a light on a ball, it's going to have a hot spot and it's going to diminish back towards the back. Now, a lot of other flat earthers have said that the moon is a self-lighting source. And if you want to look at that biblically, God created the two great lights in the sky. He doesn't say anything about the moon reflecting the sunlight or anything like that. They're supposedly their own individual lights. So there's obviously several different perspectives on it, and that's why you will not always get two flat earthers agreeing on the same model. But the reason we bring this up is because this is for you guys to decide and for you to do your own research on. But I think these are just some of the more glaring things that, we really need to look at.
And don't ever let anybody tell you that you can't make conjectures, because you are not out to deceive yourself. So if I'm thinking of ways that the Earth might be different or ways that things might work, I'm not trying to deceive myself. So I think it's fine to make conjectures and to maybe make some random guesses, because they have to fit my evidence, they have to fit my observations. That's how but if we're getting lied to everywhere you look, that's when sometimes you got to stop listening to that and maybe listen to yourself. You're not trying to lie to yourself, so at least if you think something works a certain way and you find out it doesn't, then you change your belief and move on.
Yep, very well. Okay, so next thing up that I want to talk about is eclipses, I think, are a problem. Now, one of the biggest arguments that we get from globe believers is, how do eclipses work on a flat Earth? Well, there are several schools of thought on that, but I think what we want to start out with first is looking at why the heliocentric eclipse model is unrealistic, okay? And if you look at this diagram here, basically what it's showing is it's showing the sunlight coming in at straight lines, to the moon, but yet the shadow is focused down to a very small point, okay? Now, last year, I think it was August of last year, that we had the solar eclipse. Myself and my family, we all went to Nebraska to see the sun eclipse in its totality. And one of the interesting things that they told us that was predicted and verified by us with our balloon that we launched was that the umbra would be about 70 miles. Now, if you don't know what the umbra is, that's the part of essentially totality, the very darkest part. Then there's supposed to be what's called a penumbra, which is kind of a twilight zone. But we never really actually witnessed a penumbra. We saw a shadow, an umbra, and then back to daylight. But the interesting thing about that is if the moon is only casting a 70-mile wide shadow on the Earth, then logical thought would make you wonder, well, if you turn that around and we're looking at a lunar eclipse where the Earth is supposedly blocking the sunlight from the moon, then you would expect to see something on the order of about 4 times that size. It's a little bit less than that, of a shadow on the moon, right? But we don't see that. And in fact, what they tell us is that let me find this here really quick. The Earth's shadow actually comes in at 5,600 miles, the umbra. Okay, that's huge. That's absolutely enormous. It's way bigger than the moon. You can barely see this curvature coming over the moon. They also tell us, first of all, that the only a ball or something that is spherical can cause a curved shadow. And I'm sure Ira's got something that can disprove that very quickly. But we'll get back to that. So anyway, instead of seeing an umbra that would be about 257 miles because the Earth is 3.67 times larger than the moon, we get an umbra of 5,600 miles. And why would that be? If we're both roughly 93 million miles away from the sun, and if the moon is casting that 70-mile umbra on the Earth, from the solar eclipse, then when you flip that around, it should be roughly about 257 miles that we should be seeing going across the moon. That's another incongruency. Now, the Globers will tell you, well, the mathematics all works out for it, but they're basing that math on these type of angles, which are absolutely unrealistic. This is not how shadows are cast. In fact, most of the time, we all see if you have a light source and we're casting a shadow, I'm seeing my shadow now, the shadow is typically bigger than the object that's casting it, okay? So that's just another incongruency that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. And that's something for you guys to think about and see if that actually weighs out for you. And like I said, if you check the mathematics that NASA gives you, they use this type of model, and the mathematics will actually check out. But common sense tells you that it cannot, because light does not propagate this way. So another big problem.
Well, and I would add in there, and let me know if my volume's any better, but there's been a few times where during solar eclipses, the shadow of the moon on the Earth was less than 2 miles in diameter, which really begs the question, how is an object that's supposedly, 1,000 miles, they say, in diameter, or radius or whatever for the moon.
60.
How is it possible for an object that large to cast a shadow that's only 2 or even 50 or 70 miles in diameter? It's ridiculous, actually, because in nature, shadows simply don't behave that way. A shadow will, if you're talking about a single light source, a shadow will always be as large and angular size as the cross section of the object that's creating the shadow. And never in a natural environment can you demonstrate shadows getting smaller and smaller proportionally with distance from the obstruction. This is the opposite of what anybody can reproduce in a lab with light and shadow, and yet it is a staple of the heliocentric theory that shadows behave like this, but only in their, ridiculous space model. And you see this sort of anti-pseudoscience or anti-science just all over the globe Earth theory, and that's another huge reason why more and more people are looking at this, because if you look at the fairy tales that we bought into as literally young children with the globe, if you look at that as a skeptical, rational adult, it just falls apart. It really does, and this is one of those really good examples with the diameter of the moon shadow.
And
Certainly
also,
couldn't be coming from an object that large.
Also, don't forget that the NASA and the mass media, when they talk about eclipses, they never mention the selenium, the eclipse where the sun and the moon are both in the view, and the shadow from the moon start coming from the top to the bottom, which is not possible in the heliocentric theory. And that kind of eclipses, they never mention that. In fact, if you go into the science source, they're going to tell you that is geometrically impossible. So they refer again to this magic refraction property that, everything is aligned and it has no sense.
Yeah, exactly. And that's funny you mentioned that, Eru, because I took this quote directly from Wikipedia. And, of course, like you said, the selenilian, God, that's hard to say for me, eclipses occur when both the sun and the moon are above the horizon in the sky. They're rare, but they absolutely do happen. So the mainstream explanation from Wikipedia tells us that they say, although the moon is in Earth's umbra, both the sun and eclipsed moon can be simultaneously seen because atmospheric refraction causes each body to appear higher in the sky than their true geometric positions. And to that I say, BS alert, BS alert. That is absolutely preposterous. That there is no way that you would get that type of refraction, especially looking up, up in the sky. There's just nothing about that makes any sense. And again, you have to research a little bit into atmospheric refraction to understand why that is absolutely impossible. But the selenium eclipse, wow, I have a hard time with that, is one thing that absolutely, in our opinion, debunks the heliocentric model totally. So what do flat earthers believe? Well, they're saying, what exactly is causing the eclipses? Well, first of all, you have to kind of pull your train of thought away from the heliocentric model and understand that the general flat earth model, and we're not saying that there is an actual model, but the general consensus is that in the flat earth, the sun and the moon are considerably closer. There's been speculation of anywhere from, several miles high to 3,415.9 miles, which is something I came up with. And you can actually triangulate the moon and get that distance if you do a triangulation on it. Okay? So, but in the flat earth model, if you have the sun and the moon considerably closer, then when you're looking at something like a 70-mile umbra, casting an umbra on an eclipse, and you have a moon that is roughly 35 miles or so in diameter, that makes a whole lot more sense. Okay, now as far as the lunar eclipse, there's a lot of speculation on that, but ancient cosmology, going back to Vedic cosmology and all the ancient cosmologies, talk about other black bodies in the sky that we are not able to see. They've been labeled Rahu and Ketu as possibly other black bodies. There's a lot of things up there that we are not told about, but that really don't make a whole lot of sense as far as that. So that is an alternative. We don't actually know, but we do know that it's pretty strange that when we were watching the solar eclipse, that we never actually got a chance to see the moon coming in front of it. Even when it was in totality, we should have seen, with the naked eye, we should have seen something called earthshine, and we were not able to. And basically, there are pictures of people that claim they've gotten earthshine out. When we went to Nebraska, we had several cameras operational. We were not able to pull one image of earthshine out. And really, when you consider how much more reflective the Earth is, bouncing all that light back, especially from the vantage point of totality, we should have been able to see some moon body there. So what actually causes it, it's hard to say. But ancient cosmology says that there are other bodies up there. So that's, something that you might want to consider. All right. So next up, let me minimize this, and we're going to have Jeran kind of take it from here. And this is from a video that he did very recently. And this is another major incongruity about moonlighting. And so I'll let you take it away, Jeran.
Yeah, so we know that the rule of light, or the way that it works with reflections or light, is called the inverse square law, where basically if you reduce your distance by half, then something gets 4 times as bright. So even these lights here that are blinding me now, if I were to get half, or go twice half as far, then it's going to be 4 times as bright, and that's calculable. So if we were to look at the moon when it's full and kind of picture how bright that is, we can call that 100 lumens as it's on the screen. You can really call that whatever number you want, and then the times at the end would come out the same. But let's say it's 100 lumens, then at half the distance, at 120K, it would be 400 lumens. At 60,000 miles, it would be 1,600 lumens, and so on and so forth, down to where you get to 1,000 miles. And the reason I stopped there is because at 1,000 miles away from the moon, you would be able to see the entire thing. So I figured that's a good place to start, or a good place to stop. And at that point, you would be at 6,553,000 lumens, and then divide that by your original 100, and you get that the moon would be 65,530 times brighter when you were at 1,000 miles from it. So then you go look at these supposed moon landings when men were claimed that they were near it, and this is a picture from about 1,000 miles away. And does that moon look to be 65,000 times as bright as the moon that we see? Well, clearly not. So from that, you can really draw your conclusions that something's amuck here. Either that picture isn't taken from 1,000 miles, or that's not the distance of the moon. But regardless, we know that there's a lie somewhere there, that we don't know where that is. And then also in this next shot, it's something you can just think about, really blows out of the water as far as anything. If you look at what the sun would look like, imagine that the sun's 1,000 miles away. This would be what we would see. It would just be completely washed out, so bright, and that would be at 1,000 miles.
Right, because remember, the sun has a diameter of 865,000 miles.
Right.
That's mammoth.
Imagine it's above us at 1,000 miles. The whole sky would be sunlight. So then if we reduce that distance and say now it's at 93 million miles, this is what we see, right? We see the sun in the sky that we're told it's 93 million miles. You can basically hold a dime at arm's length and cover the entire sun.
That's that half-degree angle that we see.
And so that is what we could call that 8 light minutes, right? We were all taught that it takes the sunlight 8 minutes to get from the sun to us. So that's 8 light minutes away, that distance. And then if we reduce that or double that distance again, which would then be 16 light minutes. So think about reducing the size of the sun. Now it's at 16 light minutes, and then we do it again, double it again, the distance, and now we'd be at 30 light minutes. Eventually, you're not going to see the sun anymore. So let's do it again, double it again. Now you're at a light hour, and your sun is going to be a pinprick in the sky at most. But let's multiply that by 24, and now we're at a light day. And now you're just not going to see the sun, period. But we'd have to still multiply that by 365 times, and then we'd be at a light year, and we're still nowhere close to the distance of any star. The closest star is said to be 25 trillion miles, which is it's just wrong. I mean, I don't think it's right for us to even assume that we could ever see that far. 1 million seconds is 31,000 years. So to think that we can see 25 trillion miles is insane. And especially when we just did the reduction on the size of the sun, you're going to lose it at probably a light hour, even if it's 93 million miles away, even if it's 865,000 miles wide. So really, it just gets to the point where their stories don't even hold up anymore.
Yep. So yeah, these are things that are very concerning. Of course, one of the things I talked about at the Raleigh conference was the idea that the North Star Polaris is at about 430 light years away. Now, that figure is so large that it is almost incomprehensible, and yet we can look up and see it with the naked eye, and this simply defies all logic. It completely defies the inverse square law of light. It completely defies angular resolution of the eye. These stars simply are not this distance. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that, throughout all time, the stars have never changed. We're whipping through space. Not only are we rotating at 1,040 miles per hour, but we're going around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour. The sun is going around the Milky Way at 670,000 miles an hour, and then the Milky Way is going around the Great Attractor at over 2.1 million miles an hour. And in all that time, we've got ephemerises that date back over 2 millennia. We have all kinds of other devices. Sailors have navigated, and never have the constellations ever changed. Not even the least little bit. What is the mainstream explanation for that? Well, they're just so far away that we can't notice them moving. That's ridiculous, right?
Or that it'll move in a couple thousand years, or it used to be different a few thousand years ago. But I pointed out earlier this year that there was a program online where you could go and you could enter any date and it would pull up the sky at that date. Well, I would go back to 1500 BC or 3500 AD, and Polaris still stood right in the middle. And I made a video about it and showed it and said, hey, these guys are saying that Thuban was the North Star back when the pyramids were built, and they're saying it's going to be Vega or something in a few thousand years. And within a week, I went back, somebody emailed me and said, hey, how did you do that? How did you get those dates entered into that website? And I said, you just press the back arrow until you get there. And he said, well, we won't let you do that anymore. So I went to the site, and sure enough, if you go there today, it stops at 1500 AD. You can only go back 500 years and only forward 500 years. So again, these are the kind of changes that should make people question things, because before you were able to go back any distance you wanted in the past or in the future. And for them to make such a quick change to the program, to not allow you to do that, well, why not? Well, the reason why is because the stars would not be correct tomorrow or the day after in their program if they allowed for them to change as we're taught, that they change in these 4,000-year stretches. Rather, they stay there. They don't move.
Yep. So, yeah, obviously.
Well, you have this other point, too. I mean, if we're going to speak quickly on Polaris, that's a huge part of Flat Earth Awakening is the explanation that the globe earthers have for Polaris is just nonsense. Observationally, you can point a camera or a telescope at Polaris at any time of the night and come back weeks or years or decades later, and it's still going to be in that same spot. It doesn't move. It hasn't apparently gone out of alignment with our so-called axis. For all of known history, Polaris has always been there. And yet, we have this thing called precession of the equinoxes, which is a long-term 26,000-year cycle of the heavens, which is observable. However, what their explanation is that it's the axis of the Earth going along this long-term wobble that takes 26,000 years. And yet, Polaris remains aligned to that axis, which is physically impossible. When you consider that the precession cycle is supposedly 26,000 years, then that equates to 1 degree every 72 years. And if you break that down, we should be seeing a quarter of a degree misalignments within 18 years between the axis and Polaris. And yet there it is. Even the name goes back to ancient Roman times when it was named Polaris as well. And yet you'll still get people that argue that this changes over time, and yet there's no evidence for that at all. It's a big monkey wrench in the working cogs of the globe Earth theory, just like everything else is when you dig into it.
Yep.
Yeah, the shafts of the Great Pyramid are aligned with Polaris. But they won't tell you that because then you would question, well, when were the pyramids built? How could it be aligned at our North Star? Well, they tell you that when they built them 4,000 years ago, it just so happened that the shafts were lined up at the previous North Star. So then you have to believe that for 4,000 years, it just so happens that the shafts weren't pointed at anything. And then we just happen to be living during the time where they've now realigned with Polaris.
Yeah, they alter the story constantly. It's really ridiculous. So anyway, and Iru, anytime you want to cut in with your presentation, just let me know.
Okay. No, but you know what? I believe that, at least for me, was really because we are so being indoctrinated with the image of the ball Earth that for me, when I enter in this situation of flat Earth, something that really helped me to, program my mind was to see what is the Earth from the top, and because a lot of people they don't realize that. Sorry for the Spanish language of the article, but if you Google or if you do your own math to calculate and determine the curvature of the Earth, everybody knows that it's like 8 inch per mile square. So exponential because it's a sphere. But what that means is that mathematically speaking, they can't escape from this number. So they need to say, okay, if the Earth is a sphere of 6,000 approximate radius, you must go just 20 kilometers up in the sky to really see the curvature. And of course, that height is only achieved by military plane, not by civilian planes. So you're never going to see that kind of point of view in real life. This picture here is made in AutoCAD by a friend of mine, which is civil engineering, and what you see in the magenta color is the curvature that you must see at that altitude. And this is an article from a Science magazine, which it says 20 kilometers up in the sky is the curvature of the Earth is clearly perceptible. So the problem is that every balloon that was launched with rectilinear lenses is shown a straight horizon. And, some people start to get confused because sometimes you can see a circle, not a curvature. And that is for the configuration of the lens, because the lens have a little circular shape, so the light reach every point on the lens at different distance. And of course, the human eye is also have the same shape. But when you go to, for example, OptiWiki, which is like a Wikipedia for the physical optics guys, it's going to tell you the resulting image will obviously be circular. So for me, when I start to see all these pictures, and that tiny point there is the moon, and that is the sun. So when you start to see this kind of image, which of course you're never going to find it in mass media or NASA, or nobody is going to, show you this kind of thing, I start, questioning myself that, okay, the Earth could be flat. Of course, because, for example, here you can see with real clouds morphing in real time. This is a time lapse. And it's impossible at 40 kilometers up in the sky have the horizon straight. In fact, it's more impossible when you start looking at, I'm sorry because I don't want to get much time in this, but this is a comparison situation when you have a sounding rocket reach 120 kilometers and in comparison with the weather balloons. And both show the same thing. I mean, the horizon totally in a straight line and rise to the eye level. And this is, the rocket images are from official space agency. But there is an alternative program because when they want to do real science, they don't launch heavy rocket, because the heavy rocket has an arc trajectory because it's ending in the ocean or some place in the land. But when you're trying to, really do real science, these agencies use sounding rockets. And the sounding rockets show the same thing as the weather balloon. which refer, on a big plane, because if not, this image, for example, here, it cannot be in a straight line, 120 kilometers up in the sky. So, for me, was something that really helped me to wash the image of the global Earth in my head and replace with real footage, with real life, with real experiments, and different videos from different people, not only for space agencies and that kind of thing.
Yep. Okay, very good. All right, so let's move on to another incongruity that we consider a major problem with the heliocentric model.
Real quick before you do, I'm supposed to correct Jeranism. It's 1 trillion seconds, not 1 million.
Yeah, I got the text message. I guess if I said that it's 1 trillion seconds is 31,000 years. So if I said 1 million, I apologize.
Okay, there you go. All right.
Oh,
okay.
The Earth must be a globe after all.
Yeah, that's it.
Yep. I feel the spinning now. I didn't feel it before, but...
All right, so the next thing that we consider to be a major incongruency with the ball Earth model is the climates, the northern hemisphere as compared to the southern hemisphere. Now, the interesting thing about these differences in climates, of course, we all know that Antarctica is supposedly the most inhospitable place on Earth, and I have no reason to doubt that. And in fact, in the flat Earth model, you would definitely get very little sun, and it would make a lot of sense that it would be considerably colder. But the thing that's very interesting about that is that Earth is nearly 400 times closer to the sun during the southern hemisphere summer, meaning when it's our winter time, the Earth is nearly 400 times closer, not 400 times, 400 Earth diameters closer. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Okay, and 400 Earth diameters is a huge number. It's about 3 million miles? Mm-hmm. About 3 million miles. Okay, so if the southern hemisphere summertime is 400 Earth diameters closer to the sun, then theoretically you would have more of a tropical type of climate, especially in comparison to the northern hemisphere. And I'm talking specifically, when I quote these, I'm talking about the Arctic Circle versus the Antarctic Circle. So the average winter temperature in the Antarctic Circle is 45 degrees colder than the average Arctic Circle temperature. And the average summer temperature in the Arctic Circle is 45 degrees warmer than it is in the Antarctic Circle. That's a complete incongruency. That is a 90-degree difference between, over the year in temperatures between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. This makes absolutely no sense. If the Earth is on its tilt and we're getting these parallel sun rays that are getting to us, and not only that, like I said, we're 400 Earth diameters closer to the sun in the Antarctic summer, we should see the Antarctic being considerably warmer than the Arctic Circle, and yet doesn't happen. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, another thing that's very interesting also about the Antarctic is if we are on a spinning ball, they would theoretically have 24-hour sun down there. Now, what's really bizarre about that is every video that we have ever found, there are gaps. They will show the sun going around, and you'll see the clock going with it, and there's like sometimes an 8 to 10 hour gap, roughly, and they just cut it out. And Jeran did some interesting investigation into that. He had some correspondence back and forth with the people down there, and why don't you tell them what we found out, what they told you about that?
Yeah, basically they just refused to do it, even though it's in their mission statement that they're supposed to provide this kind of evidence to the public. But when I asked them to do that, they said, well, we don't have enough bandwidth to send those full time lapses. And I said, well, you're sending an entire year of half-day footage. Why not do 6 months of full-day footage? Nobody wants to see the same half-day over and over again. So just really interesting that they won't show that. And some videos have come out since then that certainly seem to some of us to be fabricated. And, again, I do think that there might be, these full days of light. But it doesn't mean that there's a full day of sun and the sun is just circling your head. Again, if that was happening for 6 months, would Antarctica be this frozen tundra?
Right.
If you've got full 6 months of sun, I don't think that that's necessarily what you would get.
Right.
And sorry, Bob, for interrupt you, but something really quickly. One great detail about Antarctic is that when, I don't know if you are seeing my screen share, but
no, we're not.
Okay, really quickly. The Antarctic continent, for the normal science, it's the most highest continent in promedy. I don't know which is the English word for that, but I mean it's the most highest continent of all in terms of the media of the altitude of the continent, which is
highest
about
elevation.
Yeah, average terrain
the media
elevation.
highest elevation, exactly, which is 2,500 meters. So when the people, trying to get, funny about the flat earth and say, hey, where is all the water spill over the edge of the flat earth and things like that, it's that, if you want to address that really serious, you must be considered that even NASA, when they launch the weather balloons in Antarctic, they see a straight horizon line at 40 kilometers up there, and a huge amount of ice. And if you consider that altitude situation, you must be trying to get in your mind the picture of a plate, because if this is the border or the edge of our plane of existence and is the highest in promedy of all continents, you have the shape like a plate, contain all the water. And of course, if you go into the geological research, you're going to find that 12 kilometers is the most that the humans have, go down, which is the super cola hole, deep hole, and up to the sky no more than 50 kilometers. So we have the measurement of our limit, if you want to see in that perspective. So that is something that, and of course, they want to use the Antarctic territory as a Martian surface. In fact, they say that they train there because it's so similar to Mars. So maybe they can fake, some Mars landing situation in the future.
And just my opinion on this too, I disagree that I don't think that is the height of Antarctica, because every image I've ever seen shows the ice shelf coming off the water, and then you get this flat plateau. And I've heard of people skiing across it and people hiking across it, but you never see them. How are they getting to 2 miles high? 2 miles high is that's 10,000 feet. So you would have to be going uphill at some point, and they don't do that. So it's almost as if there's just a plateau. It's off the water, but it's certainly not very high off the water. And then I had to ask myself, well, why would they tell us that it's so high? Well, they tell us it's so high because that explains why it's ice if it's getting 6 months of sun. Because, the sun goes right above the equator, and the equator has mountains that are obviously full of snow constantly. So it's just another thing where that picture there, look at that. I mean, that's a flat land coming off the water. How is that 2 miles high? It's just something I've thought about before. I don't ever see that.
I see what you're saying. I just think that there are, at least in some places in the far south and in the Antarctic, lots of mountains, and so maybe they factored those the elevation of those mountains into the average terrain, and that's where they get the high average.
Yeah, that average is the word that I don't recall. That is,
Yep. Okay. So anyway, we don't really get any solid official 24-hour footage. We do occasionally see somebody will come out with a 24-hour footage, but I mean, it is so clearly CGI. They will start at a point, they'll go around 24 hours, and then they'll come back, and you'll see that the cloud formation is absolutely identical to the start point of the video. I mean, there's just so many incongruities of these videos, and it's clear they're trying to hide something, because if there was truly a 24-hour sunshine, actual sun visibility above the horizon, like there absolutely is at the North Pole, we should have tons and tons of footage of it. They shouldn't be trying to obfuscate this and hide it. But that's exactly what we get. And we get CGIs and we get excuses like we don't have enough bandwidth from the official agencies. they're hiding something. It's as simple as that. Now, the people have been down there. They have talked about, yes, there is a 24-hour daylight, but a daylight and actual visible sun are two different things. And we've come up with a few plausible explanations for why that can happen. And this goes back into the idea of the possibility of a firmament or, some sort of atmospheric lensing going on, where you can get a phenomenon known as, it's called a coffee cup caustic. And basically what that means is that you can have a point of light, and I should have had one of these ready for it. You can have a point of light, but it can reflect around the surface and actually bring light to the opposite side of a circle. And I think that's a very plausible possibility for what's going on in the flat Earth. Again, we don't know because access to Antarctica is incredibly restricted.
There you go. Ever's got it.
Oh yeah, there you go. There's a coffee cup caustic. So, there's your source light, and this is brought on by nothing more than emulating the atmosphere and the atmospheric lensing properties of the atmosphere. Or if you want to follow the more biblical cosmology, you have Psalms 19:1 where he talks about the firmament being above us, and it's spread out like a molten glass or a crystal type of material. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, and we've actually got several things that support that argument. But again, NASA certainly is not going to be forthcoming with these answers, and in fact, they do everything they can to deceive us. And that's something that we're going to cover here in a minute. So, it's just another major incongruity. And so let's move on to another one that I think is a pretty major incongruity, and that is the fact that they tell us that we are in a pressurized Earth. We have a average pressure of 14.7 pounds per square inch at sea level, and then it goes up to whatever, it reduces slightly. But the problem with that is that the Earth is spinning, first of all. And so that would give you a centrifugal force at the equator, okay? Now they tell us that space is essentially 10 to the negative 17th torr, okay, which is a very, very low vacuum state. So essentially what we're talking about is an atmosphere right next to a vacuum. Now there is no example anywhere of that being possible without some sort of a container. You cannot have an atmosphere next to a vacuum because the vacuum would simply blow itself off into the vacuum. Now, what do they tell us about that? Well, how does the atmosphere stay on? Well, it's that magical gravity thing, okay? And gravity is something, by the way, that I'm going to be doing a presentation on what it actually is tomorrow. So you'll definitely want to stay tuned for that one. But this mainstream model of gravity is just this magical thing that controls all things. It keeps airplanes going over the ball without ever noticing it. It keeps our atmosphere on. All these things, and even at the equator, where we're spinning at 1,040 miles an hour, science tells us that the reason that Earth is an oblate spheroid is because of the stresses brought about by the centrifugal force of the Earth. Okay, great. Well, nobody's really ever been able to measure that, and in fact, one of the things that we checked that against was you should have about a 21-kilometer water buildup above and beyond the average sea depth at the equator. Is that there? Absolutely not. It is not there. There is nothing out of the ordinary about the depth of the oceans at the equator whatsoever. So again, and then you take that again to the atmosphere, there would be some enormous stresses, centrifugal type of stresses, that would literally be throwing the atmosphere out into space. But again, that magical gravity just keeps it, finely tuned where it keeps our atmosphere on us at all times. And again, there is no example, nobody can provide an example of that anywhere to show anything like that even being possible.
And don't be scared when you hear you're spinning 1,000 miles per hour. It's only like 500 miles per hour here.
Yeah, at this elevation.
You don't have to worry about that.
No, and that's a really good point, man. It's they claim that this whole infinite space theory. We have obviously pressure on Earth. That's not anything that anyone tells us. I mean, we can measure that there is a pressurized environment here. Yet, in order for the globe Earth and infinite space theory to work, you have to sort of assume that space is an infinite vacuum, more or less, and a vacuum in a sense that it is a lower pressure environment, yes, but very close to like a perfect vacuum. We're talking a very, very powerful vacuum, and yet the very diffuse and low gravity molecules that are, hundreds of miles or kilometers up or whatever, that are somehow adjacent to this infinite vacuum and yet adhere to the Earth somehow by gravity. I mean, it is just a bunch of malarkey. And if you can provide any sort of physical evidence or experimental that you can have say a balloon filled with a gas, put it in a vacuum chamber, and then pop the balloon and have that gas remain in a sphere by something in the center. I mean, it's just ridiculous, and yet that's the level that we have to sort of turn off our own intuition and turn off our own experience and just go with the pontificates of science because they're always right, which they're not.
And, the sad thing about it is the quantum mechanic description of the world, they're getting really close to having a pretty good feel of it, but the problem is that gravity doesn't mix with it at all. It's the problem with it. So, again, you have to look at that and ask, do we really have these two different mechanics of the world that are not compatible, or is it possible that gravity is not what we were taught? And if that was the case, then how much that could possibly fix? The problem with it, of course, is gravity is the only thing that they can use that describes the shape of the Earth as a ball. So once you lose gravity, all of a sudden, the first question becomes, well, how is the Earth a ball? And, if I was shown any evidence that spheres were pulled together due to some force, or that gravity pulled spheres together, but we don't see it. It's not anywhere. You can't find evidence of that, and science is supposed to be the evidence of things. So why is it on the parabolic flights that I've seen them drop a bunch of ping pong balls, and the ping pong balls go everywhere? They don't gather together at the center and then start to create a sphere. So where did these planets come from? How did they ever join together? Why are some of them gas and some of them rock? Who chose who was going to be in charge of which? And it just becomes a problem that I think gravity, or the removal of, could solve. Yeah.
And there's a ton of problems also with the famous Cavendish experiment that most people claim is done in universities, and I have no doubt that they do it. They have very little success. In fact, you hardly see any experiments online at all where it actually shows it under total controlled circumstances. And in fact, when Cavendish originally did his experiment, he was so, anal about it, I guess the only way you put it, is he actually moved far away from his shed with the two balls in it and actually observed it with a telescope so that there was no other type of gravitational influence. Of course, the ones they do in the universities are so easily debunked. In fact, our last show, I just debunked one Cavendish experiment by showing what was going on with it, and I'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. But so the Cavendish experiment is no proof, easily debunked. It just doesn't fly. So, all right. So let's move on to another thing that a lot of globe earthers will say that the eclipses, all of this stuff were only predicted on the ball Earth model. That is absolutely, positively untrue. And in fact, the eclipses were predicted long before, millennia, thousands of years before the spherical model was ever even introduced, roughly 500 years ago. One of the devices that we have in front of us, let me go to this one first. There was a device discovered, 30, 40 years ago. It was called an Antikythera device. And what this was, it was a navigation device. They didn't even know what it was when they first found it, but it was found off the coast of a place called Antikythera, Greece. Okay? And they couldn't figure out what it did. It was all fused together because it had been underwater for an eternity. And what they found out that it did was it was a precision navigation piece of equipment that not only would allow sailors to navigate, but it would predict amazing things, eclipses, all types of celestial events. It would even tell you what color the moon would be during a lunar eclipse. This type of precision. And this device is over 2,000 years old. Well, fortunately, because of 21st century technology, they were able to X-ray it, break it down, find out how it worked, and they have since replicated it. And that's how we know that here's this device that was, has been around for over 2,000 years, and they were navigating with it, and it predicted quite accurately to within seconds lunar and solar eclipses both. Another thing that does this is a device called an astrolabe. And this is another amazing forgotten device that is several centuries old, was definitely around before the advent of the globe Earth model. And it predicts any type of navigation you want to do from it, your position, the time of day, eclipses, solar, lunar eclipses, all this stuff is possible with this particular piece of equipment. And again, it is centuries old. So the reality is when people tell you, oh, well, all of our eclipses and all this stuff were based on the predictions from the ball Earth, not true. Absolutely not true. And in fact, these devices predated this by well over 1,000 years. So that's just a nonsense argument. But yeah, you'll hear that.
And a nice connection with this kind of mechanism, in fact, with the Antikythera mechanism, is that it's belong to Archimedes, that mechanism, and the Romans was captured that mechanism. And if you want to relate it, we must be assumed, and we live under the Gregorian calendar and the Julian calendar before, which is made by Romans, by Jesuits. So they twist the history, and they took this kind of mechanism and device for antique civilizations, and they use from the heliocentric, theory or model or whatever, because we are living all the time under sun worship. And when you start researching history, you're gonna always find a few a few faction which is from Romans, from Jesuits, from Jewish people that control every aspect of our life. And that, if you want to understand why they lied to us, you must be research in history.
All right. Okay, so moving on. Next thing up is, let me get back to my little image here.
And as well, I'll just bring up about eclipses. If it was true that it's because of the ball Earth, then we wouldn't have to go back to the Saros cycle to figure out how eclipses work. And even NASA, if you go to their website and look at any eclipse page, at the bottom it will say all eclipse data is provided by Fred Aspernak. So you would think if the heliocentric model was as cut and dry as they say, and you could just plug in these locations and get the eclipses, that'd be one thing, but it's not that way. They need to go to one specific guy who has studied the Saros cycle, who then tells them how eclipses will work. So clearly it's not because of the perfect ball Earth model that we know when eclipses are. We have to go to a guy who has studied the Saros cycle from, I don't know how long ago the Saros cycle was for, I think 1,500 years or something. Mm-hmm. And then you have to go back then to find out how eclipses work. So it's certainly not what we're told.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, we have ephemeris data that goes back nearly 2,000 years. And once again, constellations have never changed. All navigation, everything is just the same as it is today, except with the current rotational periods of the sky. Again, absolutely impossible, especially when in 2,000 years we should have had a completely new North Star by now. So how could that possibly be accurate? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? That's something that you need to kind of ask yourself.
And it's even older than I thought. The Saros cycle is several centuries BC, so even before, even older than 1,500 years.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So again, the claim of the heliocentrists that all of this stuff is based on our knowledge of the Earth being a sphere is ridiculous. And in fact, even going back to the Aristophanes experiment, where they had the well in Syene and I forget the other place, where they were measuring sun angles going down a well. We find, and amazingly, Neil deGrasse Tyson even admitted this, is that it will work, if it's on a heliocentric model with the sun 93 million miles away, but it will also work on a flat Earth model with a close and local sun. It works exactly the same way. So you cannot go to the Eratosthenes experiment and say that that proves unequivocally a heliocentric model, because it absolutely does not. And again, like I said, Neil deGrasse Tyson very recently made the stunning admission that that is absolutely true. So kudos to him at least for that. All right, so the next thing we have up here on the screen is when you start looking into ancient cosmologies, whether it's Egyptian, Norse, Hindu, Vedic, Hebrew, Indian tribes, all of them, all civilizations going back all the way through recorded history have depicted the Earth as flat and stationary. Now, there are some different slight variations on, this plane that we're on. And that is that there is a possibility that there are more lands outside of our little ring. There's a possibility that there are lands even above the firmament if you want to look at Vedic cosmology. But not one of them has ever, depicted the Earth the way that NASA has. And of course, if anybody has done any research into this whatsoever, we know that every single image that NASA has made of the blue marble is a fabrication. It is not a photograph. They call it an image for a reason, because it comes from their imagination. and that is probably the most apt way to describe it. All the footage that you see up there, if you look at the ISS footage, it is absolutely ridiculously fake. In fact, for the first year and a half of Globebusters, Jeran and I did the ISS Tuesday nights. We did an ISS where we would observe the ISS and how utterly ridiculous it was and how incongruent everything about it was. From lack of parallax. You're watching the ISS go over, you should see parallax. And what parallax is imagine yourself driving a car down a highway. And if you pick a point out on the horizon, you will notice that it's coming and moving very, very slowly towards you. Whereas when you get closer to that point, it speeds up, goes faster and faster and faster, and then whizzes by you on the sides. That's parallax. Okay, when you look at the ISS footage, that simply is not there, and that is simply impossible. They cannot emulate the parallax, and that tells you right then and there that is absolutely fake. And not to mention all the other things, cloud patterns, all the other crazy things that go on. The fact that you can never see any land features, really. They don't ever show any lights at night on the ISS. Just so many things. It's hard to list them all. But it's absolutely as phony as a $3 bill, and all you have to do is just apply a little bit of critical thinking to what you're looking at when you look at these ISS feeds. And we were going to show you some today, but believe it or not, they seem to be offline. Wonder why. Maybe they didn't want us showing that at the Flat Earth Conference.
And you must be remembered that when they call about photograph, there is a photograph. I'm going to show really quickly. But you must be remembered that supposedly the only real photograph that NASA claims to be true is the 1972 Apollo 17 mission, when they come to the Earth. But, if you start studying a few devices that they have patented from the early 20th century, they have these kind of devices which, the real name is Device for Producing Illusionary Effects. And they're using the Mercury mission, to, make the blueprints of the Earth and things like that. So they have this kind of technology. So that is why when you go, for example, to this kind of picture, which is totally different in a few years, 1967 to 1972 is almost the same but complete different sizes. And they practice because at that time they don't have the technology that we have today. I made this in a couple of hours in the 3D Studio Max, which you can see that if you are NASA and you have $50 million each day, of course you can launch some balloons, pick up real footage, mapping that onto a 3D sphere. And in our days, we are not, monkeys in computer technology. So we can recreate, replicate, you can do whatever you want. And they have some major failures in the ISS with wires, and when if we have the time, we can show things like that. But it's really easy in our days to recreate this kind of image. Of course, you're never going to find a morphing cloud in a time lapse on the ISS, and that is, you must be paying attention of those things, because that is where you must go in the details. If not, you're going to pass over.
There you go. Okay, so needless to say, there's a lot of things that leave a lot to be desired as far as proof for the heliocentric model. Another thing that a lot of people will talk about is, we can see the ISS up there. Well, yeah, we see something up there. And in fact, it's even been photographed. Jeran himself did a ISS transit over the sun. And honestly...
Moon.
The moon, I'm sorry, that's right. And Karen got the one over the sun, right? Karen B, yeah. Okay. So the flat earthers, we ourselves have actually photographed something that appears to look like the ISS. What it actually is, I don't know. We were talking the other day about this whole Project Bluebeam, that people are talking about, well, this is what it could potentially be. And I think that that's very likely, but most people think that Project Bluebeam is going to be the catalyst for the fake alien invasion. Well, in my opinion, when I first started researching conspiracies like 20 plus years ago, one of the first things I looked into was the chemtrails, right? And the chemtrails, interestingly enough, are made up of three primary components. One is aluminum, the other is barium, and the third is strontium. Well, something that I looked into back then and has since disappeared basically off the web is that when these three compounds are mixed together, what happens is it gives you an ideal projection media for holographic images. And every university and their brother was doing studies on this, and they all just disappeared in favor of a storage technique called strontium niobate, which is fairly unrelated. But I think that's very interesting that Project Bluebeam was well known about and documented, and I think basically what it has done is it's evolved to now where they can actually project a lot of these images in the sky. This is pure conjecture on my part, but again, as a flat earther, you can think about things like this, because if we're going to get to the bottom of this, you've got to think outside of the box. You cannot think inside the box, because if you think inside what you've been trained, whether you've been to college, university, or whatever, all you're doing is you're using the tools that they've given you and taught you to regurgitate. Basically, it is not logical, deductive thinking. They don't teach you that in schools. It's all a memorization process. And anyway, we've talked about that on the show. So the next thing I want to bring up really quick, and Jeran is going to cover this, is...
Yeah, and stemming off what you were just saying, too,
okay.
that they don't teach you certain things in school that you would think that they would. For instance, the idea that the Earth is spinning. Okay, so that is one thing, and of course none of us feel that. But we then have airplanes that travel in both directions around the Earth or across the Earth. So this video here is just showing, if you take the Earth, and we're going to start spinning it here in a second, and really think about this and don't just default to what we were all taught, but actually consider the fact that if a plane like this one here is going to start traveling on this Earth, you'll notice that it's going to catch that red circle pretty quickly because the Earth is spinning towards it, right? And if the plane goes the opposite direction, well, as you'll see here in a second, it won't even ever catch the red dot because the Earth is outrunning it. And that's what happens if the Earth is spinning 1,000 miles per hour. We know planes go 500. So what that means is that, that a certain direction, the plane could only go half the speed of the spinning Earth. Yet we know that when you fly in either direction on the Earth, that there is no change. In fact, the only change is the opposite of this, meaning if you believe in the globe Earth, then you believe that the plane that is not catching the red dot is the faster of the two planes, which makes no sense at all. Clearly, the plane that has the red dot running to it would be faster, but not on the globe Earth. On the globe Earth, if you fly from California to New York, that trip is faster than if you fly from New York to California, which doesn't make any sense. The Earth is spinning towards New York, and if you're traveling from New York going to California, you should get there much faster. The Earth is spinning to you. It's coming to you. But it doesn't take place. So really, you can just think, and here it's better shown with the red plane and the blue plane, that on the globe Earth, that the blue plane is considered to be faster, even though it can't catch the red dot. So sometimes I think something simple like that is just overlooked, that we know that we're not spinning. I mean, we were given a vestibular system that tells you, I mean, if everybody turns your head to the side right now, you'll be shocked to see that the room does not change its orientation, that your eyes work as a gyroscope. Your entire brain portrays the world for you correctly. You would know, believe me, you would know if you were spinning. You couldn't face north for 5 minutes and turn and face south. You'd fall down. So there's so many things that I think tell us and scream that you're not spinning, you're not moving, that planes are both taking off from the Earth that is still, and that's why they both fly, and that's why the one that goes to New York is faster, because the winds blow that direction, which again is a problem for the spinning Earth, because the trade winds, or the jet stream down south, is measured up to 250 miles per hour, but that jet stream goes to the east, which is the same direction that the Earth spins. So imagine grabbing a basketball and spinning it, and the air around it somehow goes faster than the ball is spinning. And that's what happens on the Earth. It's a 1,000-mile-per-hour spin, but the air is going 300 miles per hour faster in the same direction of spin. It's just not possible.
And they try and obfuscate this with, something called frames of reference. And this all goes back to Einstein's relativity theory, which it has been debunked so many times by modern-day physicists, it's ridiculous. But that's a subject for another talk.
Yeah, because then you
have when I was
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, when I was young, I took my first flight from Florida to Dallas-Fort Worth, and I was kind of bored on the flight, and so I started wanting to figure out how much shorter duration the westbound flight would be compared to the eastbound flight, because, of course, when you're flying west, you're flying against the spin of the Earth, right? And so you should have a huge advantage for westbound planes, as their destination should be racing to meet them. And I was baffled, still pretty young, but I was baffled because working out the time zone differences, the two flights were actually the same in that case. And I remember getting off the plane telling my aunt, I figured out that the Earth isn't spinning, basically, and she talked me down, told me I didn't understand it, and that was exactly the argument that she used was, the frame of reference of when the plane begins its journey is carried with it for the duration of the journey. So, in other words, if the plane is traveling, say, 1,000 miles east at takeoff, then even though it accelerates west, it still remains traveling at 1,000 miles east during the duration of the journey. And that is sort of allowed by the atmosphere itself being sort of velcroed or tattooed to the frame of reference with the Earth. And really, when you think about it a little bit and you assume that the Earth is a globe no matter what, that kind of makes sense, but it really physically doesn't. Westbound flights should be very short in duration, should be a breeze, while eastbound flights should be much more difficult to achieve just simply because of this fact. And yet we are so conditioned to think that the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what, it's justified. And that is one of the big magic tricks I think of the heliocentric proponents, is that they've somehow made it so that people believe that any and all information or observation that you can have must be occurring on a spinning ball. And so everything sort of works that way psychologically. I mean, it's very deceptive. So, like, just as one example, things fall to the earth when you drop them, right? What goes up must come down. And that, if you think about it, that would be the last thing that you would expect to see if the Earth was actually a spinning ball. You wouldn't expect to see objects falling to the ground, and yet somehow this has been conditioned into people as proof of a spinning ball Earth with gravity. So it is this sort of just anti-logical way of thinking that is masqueraded as science when it is in fact nothing more than philosophy and pseudoscience.
And in fact, something that really quickly, there is, a lot of people, a lot of scientists know there is the anomaly of atmospheric revolution, which called ARA, which proposed that if the Earth is spinning and the viscosity of the air is that supposedly that, make all the spin in the atmosphere together, we don't see the winds that supposedly we must be see in that kind of situation. And really quickly, talking about the planes, for people out there who wants to investigate a little more, a few months ago in the Globebusters show, we present the issue that the flight that comes from Zurich to San Pablo, which is, above the equator down to the equator, because it starts in Europe and goes to South America. All the time we see the same constellation and the same Milky Way, which is not possible if the Earth is a sphere and the plane is traveling from the top of the world to the bottom of the world. And in fact, when you make this kind of simulation in Google Earth, for example, the Milky Way is changing because you are going down from the Zurich to San Pablo. But in the real life, in the real flight, we don't see that, for example. Of course, we see that the Earth is totally flat and the Milky Way is the same at the beginning to the end of the flight, and that is not due to the rotation of the Earth in synchronicity with the flight, with the plane, with the ground, with everything, which is nonsense. So if you start looking into the details, you're going to find that the heliocentric model, the rotation of the Earth, never has been proved. Nobody detected. No organism, live organism, or even a machine. Nobody can detect that motion. So, this kind of situation from the real life must be called to your attention.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, guys, we are running out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But I just want to throw out a couple other things really quick. We had lots of NASA fakery, on the ISS where they're using CGI, green screens. That's stuff that you could find everywhere on the internet. I'm sure other people will be presenting it. But to say that there is a lot of it would be an understatement. It is absolutely voluminous. NASA has been busted left, right, upside down, every way but Sunday using CGI, fakery. It is ridiculous. Harnesses, green screen malfunctions, augmented reality. It's over the top. But this is basically what the thing is NASA. In Hebrew, a lot of people will say it means to deceive. Okay, the people that are running this world are very much of the Luciferian agenda. They are, a lot of people would straight up say they're Satanists. Their methodology is to hide things in plain sight, to reverse things, turn them upside down, make them backwards, but they always put things right in front of your face. And this is something, what I'm going to show you now is something that is, it's mind-blowing, honestly. And this is taken from the 2001-2002 Blue Marble, which again was a complete fabrication. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see a little bit of image processing where they first flip it upside down, and you're going to see an interesting image. But then they're going to turn it upside down and reverse it. And what you're going to see is absolutely going to blow your mind, and I'm just going to leave that with you. So here we have the fake blue marble image, and what they're going to do is they're going to mirror it right to left, and look at the interesting picture that comes out of that. So you might think, oh, well, that's, you can do that with a lot of things. That's a coincidence, right? Well, you could think that. But now, what we're going to do is he's going to take this image, and we are going to not only flip it, but we're going to rotate it, and then we're going to do the image, and look what comes out now. All right? Just take a look at that for a minute. What we're seeing here is we're seeing like a Masonic apron. We're seeing the all-seeing eye. We are seeing like an Anunnaki type of reptilian creature here with some sort of, halo or a crown or something like that. You have the symbol here that's on the back of the dollar bill, E pluribus unum. But this is straight up Luciferian, guys, and they put it right in front of our face. You just have to know where to find it. This is what we're dealing with, and it is an uphill battle, believe me. So with that, we're going to close it out.
I think Iro had something else to show.
Did
or-
Duro have one thing? Because, okay,
You have one thing to show or no, Iro?
Yeah, because we're
What?
we're out of time, Iro. So did you have something?
No, okay. No, it's okay. In fact, I found it yesterday, a pentagram on the moon. You remember that, epic moon crossing over the Earth, showing, well, if you post that and you, I did the screen capture and I contrast the image and appear a pentagram, which is something that, is full of symbolism, because it's like Confucius, the philosopher, the Chinese philosopher says, the world is not ruled by law, it's ruled by symbols. And that is why if I take right now, if I do, if the people have, doubts about this, someone explain this, this is a pyramid with the all-seeing eye right in the middle of the, I don't know if you are seeing because I don't have the feedback from my camera, but if this don't call your attention, you are totally asleep, man.
Yep, exactly. All right, guys. So we are out of time. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Thanks,
We'll
guys.
be back tomorrow with more presentations. And thank you a lot. Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Give it up for Globebusters, Bob and Jeran, Iro and John. Love you, bro. Thanks, man.
Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video presentation. If you did, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, like the video, and share it on your favorite social media sites. There's a lot more to come, so stay tuned and we'll see you back next time.